There is a scene at the very beginning of the Bible that most people remember only in fragments. A garden, a man, a woman, a serpent, and a forbidden tree. But there's another tree standing in that garden. Quieter, less discussed, almost hidden behind the drama of everything else. Yet it may be the most important tree in the entire Bible. The tree of life. It appears near the opening pages of Genesis. And then, strangely, it disappears. Or at least it seems to. Because if you turn to the final pages of Scripture, thousands of years later, after kingdoms have risen and fallen, after prophets have spoken, after exile and return, after crucifixion and resurrection, after every battle in the human story has been fought, you find it standing there again. The tree of life, at the beginning and at the end, like two pillars holding up the entire story. Now here is the detail most people miss. The Bible contains hundreds of symbols, mountains, rivers, temples, sacrifices, but very few symbols appear in both the first chapters of Genesis and the last chapters of Revelation. The tree of life does, which raises a question far bigger than botany, far bigger than Eden. Why does the Bible begin with humanity losing access to this tree, and end with humanity finding it again? That question leads deeper than most people expect, because the tree of life may not simply be a tree. It may be one of the most profound symbols in all of Scripture. And once you see what it represents, you begin to notice that it has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Most people assume they already know the story. Adam and Eve disobey God. They eat from the forbidden tree. Sin enters the world. Humanity is expelled from Eden. Story over. But if you slow down and read the text carefully, something strange appears. Something that does not fit the version of the story most of us carry in our heads. Because the tree that Adam and Eve actually eat from is not the tree of life. It is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That detail matters more than most people realize. The tree of life stands nearby throughout the entire episode. Untouched, unmentioned, waiting. And then only after Adam and Eve have eaten from the forbidden tree, God suddenly speaks about it, almost as if the greater danger was never the tree they chose, but the tree they might reach next. Listen carefully to what happens. After the fall, God says, "Lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." That sentence changes the entire scene, because for the first time, the tree of life moves from the background to the center, and suddenly a new question emerges. If the tree of life grants life, why was humanity allowed near it before the fall, but barred from it afterward? Why place it in the garden at all? And why does Scripture spend so little time describing its appearance while building so much mystery around its purpose? The more closely you look, the stranger it becomes. Because the Bible never seems interested in telling us what the tree of life looked like. It seems far more interested in what it meant. And that distinction changes everything. At first glance, this might seem like an ancient story about two people in a garden. But the longer you sit with it, the harder it becomes to ignore a deeper reality. Because the story of Eden is not really about trees. It is about loss. The kind of loss every human being understands. Not because we have stood in Eden, but because we have all lived outside of it. Every culture in history has carried the same ache, a longing for something that feels missing, a sense that the world is not quite what it was meant to be. We build cities, we create art, we discover medicines, we tell stories, and yet beneath all of it runs the same quiet awareness. We cannot stop aging. We cannot stop suffering. We cannot stop death. That is the human condition. And strangely, that is exactly where the tree of life enters the story. Not as a decoration, not as a piece of ancient mythology, but as the answer to a problem humanity has never solved. Notice what happens in Genesis. The moment sin enters the world, access to the tree of life becomes the central concern. Not the rivers, not the gold of the land, not even the garden itself. The tree, as though Scripture is pointing our attention towards something far larger than a physical location, something humanity lost when it lost Eden, and something it has been searching for ever since. But here is the detail that makes the story even more intriguing. The Bible never describes Adam and Eve eating from the tree of life before the fall. It simply tells us it was there, waiting, available, present, which raises another question. What exactly was humanity losing access to? A tree? A gift? Or something far more fundamental than either one? The answer begins with a single Hebrew word. The answer begins with something surprisingly small. A word. In fact, two words. The Hebrew phrase translated as tree of life is etz chaim. Etz means tree. Chaim means life. Simple enough, at least on the surface. But here is where things become interesting. Because when modern readers see the word life, they usually think of biological existence. A heartbeat, breathing lungs, a body that remains alive. But the ancient Hebrew imagination was operating with something much larger. Chaim does not merely describe existence. It describes fullness, vitality, wholeness, the kind of life that flourishes because it is connected to its source. And that distinction changes everything. Because suddenly the tree of life is no longer just a tree that prevents death. It becomes a symbol of life in its deepest sense. Not surviving, thriving, not merely existing, becoming what you were created to be. Now notice how quickly the scale begins to expand. At first, the story seems to concern a single tree standing in a single garden. A local detail, a small object. But the moment we understand what Chaim means, the tree becomes something larger. It begins to represent the question underneath every human story. What does it mean to truly live? Not simply to continue breathing, but to experience the fullness of life itself. And that question follows humanity everywhere. It follows kings sitting on thrones. It follows shepherds in the wilderness. It follows prophets in exile. It follows ordinary people struggling through ordinary days. Everyone is searching for life, more life, deeper life, a life untouched by fear, decay, and death. And here is what makes Genesis so remarkable. The Bible introduces that longing before it introduces civilization, before nations, before laws, before temples, before Israel, before almost everything else. At the center of the human story stands a symbol of life that humanity can no longer reach. A tree within sight, but beyond grasp. And suddenly Eden starts to feel less like a location in the distant past and more like a mirror. Because the distance between humanity and the tree of life begins to resemble the distance every human being has felt at some point. The feeling that something essential has been lost, something we were made for, something we still remember, even if we cannot name it. But the story goes deeper still, because Genesis does not merely tell us that the tree of life existed. It tells us exactly where it stood, and that detail matters more than most people realize. Because Genesis does not simply tell us that the tree of life existed. It tells us where it stood, in the middle of the garden, at the center, not hidden in a distant corner, not placed at the edge of Eden, at the center. And once you notice that, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Because throughout the Bible, what stands at the center is rarely accidental. The center is where heaven and earth meet. The center is where God's presence is revealed. The center is where humanity must decide what kind of world it wants to inhabit. But before we follow that pattern, we need to slow down and let Scripture guide us step by step. Because the tree of life does not disappear after Genesis. It leaves clues, small ones at first, then larger ones, until eventually an entire biblical pattern begins to reveal itself. So here is what we are going to do. First, we're going to return to Eden and look carefully at why the tree of life stood at the center of the garden. Then we're going to follow the symbol as it unexpectedly reappears in places most readers never connect to Eden at all. In wisdom literature, in temple imagery, in prophetic visions, and eventually in the final pages of Revelation. Along the way, we are going to discover something surprising. The Bible becomes less interested in describing the tree itself and more interested in describing what the tree represents. The symbol grows, the meaning expands, the pattern deepens, And what begins as a tree in a garden slowly becomes one of the most important ideas in all of Scripture. A thread running from Genesis to Revelation. A thread connecting creation, exile, redemption, and restoration. But before we can understand where that thread leads, we have to return to the place where it began. Back to Eden. Back to the center of the garden. Because hidden in the placement of the tree of life is a clue that may reshape the way we read the entire story. Because hidden in the placement of the tree of life is a clue that may reshape the way we read the entire story. Let's go back to Eden. Not to the moment after the fall. Not yet. Back to the garden as it first appears. The picture Genesis presents is surprisingly simple. A garden planted by God, rivers flowing outward, abundance everywhere. No scarcity, no violence, no fear, and at the center stand two trees. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. Now here is the detail most readers miss. Genesis spends very little time describing either tree. No height, no color, no species, no physical details. The author seems almost uninterested in their appearance, which is strange, because ancient literature often loved visual descriptions. Kings are described, temples are described, cities are described, yet the tree of life remains almost visually invisible, as if Scripture wants our attention somewhere else. Not on what it looked like, but on what it meant. And that distinction becomes important, because in the ancient Near East, trees were rarely just trees. Throughout Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan, sacred trees often functioned as symbols of divine blessing, fertility, wisdom, kingship, or connection between heaven and earth. Ancient people saw trees differently than modern people do. A tree reached into two worlds at once. Its roots descended into the hidden earth. Its branches stretched toward the heavens. It stood between realms, a living bridge, a meeting place between what is below and what is above. And suddenly the placement of the tree of life in Eden begins to feel deliberate. The center of the garden, the meeting place, the point of connection. But the story goes deeper, because the tree of life is not introduced in a world that is dying. It is introduced in a world that is already alive. That seems obvious until you stop and think about it. Adam is alive. Eve is alive. Animals are alive. Plants are alive. Everything is alive. So why place a tree of life in a world already overflowing with life? That question has puzzled readers for centuries. And the answer may be more profound than most people expect, because the tree appears to represent something more than biological survival. Remember the Hebrew word, chayim, life, but not merely existence. Life in its fullest sense. Life flowing from its source. Life connected to God. Life as it was meant to be, which means the tree of life may not simply provide life. It may symbolize participation in life, receiving life, remaining connected to life, living within the life that originates in God Himself. Now notice how the tension begins to build. If that interpretation is correct, then Eden is not merely a paradise. It is a relationship, a state of connection, a reality where humanity lives in direct dependence upon its Creator. And suddenly the story becomes intensely personal, because that is not merely Adam's story. It is everyone's story. Every human being knows what it feels like to search for life. Not survival. Life. Something deeper. Something fuller. People chase it through achievement, through relationships, through success, through pleasure, through knowledge, through power. Yet the search never seems to end. Why? Because human beings appear to carry a memory, a longing, an intuition that life is supposed to be more than endurance, more than consumption, more than simply making it through another day. The ancient story of Eden speaks directly into that longing. And then something remarkable happens. The narrative introduces a second tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For centuries, readers have focused almost entirely on that tree, and understandably so. It is the tree involved in the fall, the tree of temptation, the tree of rebellion. But when we focus exclusively on that tree, we miss what Genesis is quietly doing beneath the surface. Because the two trees function together. One represents dependence, the other autonomy. One represents receiving life from God. The other represents defining reality apart from God. One invites trust. The other promises control. And suddenly the entire human condition comes into focus. Because the temptation in Eden is not simply about eating forbidden fruit. It is about determining the source of life. Will humanity receive life as a gift, or attempt to secure it independently? Will humanity trust divine wisdom, or construct wisdom on its own terms? That question echoes through every generation. And this is where the psychological layer of the story becomes impossible to ignore. Because the desire that drives Adam and Eve is not foreign to us. It is familiar, very familiar. The desire to define ourselves. The desire to control outcomes. The desire to become self-sufficient. The desire to eliminate dependence. The desire to become our own source. And yet Scripture consistently presents that path as a dead end. The irony of Eden is profound. Humanity reaches for what appears to be greater life and loses access to life itself. The promise is expansion. The result is exile. The promise is wisdom. The result is fragmentation. The promise is freedom. The result is separation. And here the tree of life suddenly moves from the background to the center of the story. Not because humanity ate from it, but because humanity lost access to it. Notice how Genesis describes the aftermath. Cherubim are stationed at the east of the garden. A flaming sword turns in every direction. The way to the tree of life is guarded. The image is dramatic. But here is what most people miss. The text does not say the tree of life was destroyed. It remains, still standing, still present, still real. The problem is not the absence of the tree. The problem is access. That distinction changes everything. Because the Bible's central problem is not that life disappeared. The problem is that humanity became separated from its source. Life remains, but the pathway is blocked. The gift remains, but the relationship is broken. The destination remains, but the road has been lost. And this is where the story begins to expand beyond Genesis itself. Because once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. The entire biblical narrative begins to look different. Exile from Eden, exile from the promised land, distance from God's presence, longing for restoration. The pattern repeats again and again, almost as if the Bible is telling one story through many stories. The story of humanity trying to find its way back. Back to life, back to communion, back to the source. And here is where the tree of life becomes even more fascinating. Because after Genesis, it seems to disappear. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall. Patriarchs come and go. Prophets speak. Kings reign. Wars are fought. Generations live and die. And yet the tree of life appears nowhere in the narrative. Or so it seems. Because hidden in the pages of Israel's wisdom literature, the symbol quietly returns. Not as a tree growing in a garden, but as something far more surprising. And that discovery changes the way the entire symbol is understood. Because hidden in the pages of Israel's wisdom literature, the symbol quietly returns. Not as a tree growing in a garden, but as something far more surprising. And that discovery changes the way the entire symbol is understood. Most readers expect the tree of life to remain in Genesis. After all, it belongs to Eden, to beginnings, to origins, to a world that no longer exists. But hundreds of years later, long after Adam and Eve, long after Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, the symbol unexpectedly reappears. Not in a story, not in a vision, not in a prophecy, in wisdom literature. And that alone should make us stop and pay attention. Because wisdom literature asks different questions. Historical books ask what happened. Prophetic books ask what God is about to do. Wisdom literature asks how human beings should live, how to navigate reality, how to flourish in a broken world, how to find life. And that last phrase matters more than it first appears. Because when the tree of life returns, it returns in the book of Proverbs. Listen carefully. Proverbs 3 verse 18. Wisdom is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Not was, is, a tree of life. Suddenly, the symbol is doing something completely unexpected. The author is not talking about Eden, not talking about geography, not talking about a literal tree standing somewhere on earth. He takes the most mysterious symbol in Genesis and applies it to wisdom. That is a remarkable move. And it raises a question. Why? Why would Solomon connect wisdom to the tree of life? To answer that, we need to step into the world Solomon inhabited. Ancient Israel sat at the crossroads of empires. Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east. Powerful civilizations surrounded them. These nations possessed armies, technology, trade networks, political influence. Yet Israel's wisdom tradition consistently insisted that the deepest problem of humanity was not a lack of information. It was a lack of wisdom. Those are not the same thing. Information tells you what is. Wisdom teaches you how to live within what is. Information fills the mind. Wisdom shapes the soul. And Solomon understood something that remains true thousands of years later. Human beings can possess enormous knowledge while simultaneously destroying themselves. They can master technology while failing to master desire. They can understand the world while misunderstanding themselves. And this is where the tree of life symbol begins to expand. Because in Genesis, humanity reached for knowledge apart from God. Now in Proverbs, wisdom rooted in God becomes a tree of life. Notice the reversal. Notice the symmetry. Genesis presents humanity seizing wisdom on its own terms. Proverbs presents wisdom received as a gift. The pattern is not accidental. The biblical authors are connecting dots. Quietly, carefully, deliberately. And the more closely we look, the more fascinating the connection becomes. Because the Hebrew word translated as wisdom is chakma. Chakma is one of the richest words in the Hebrew Bible. Modern readers often hear wisdom and think intelligence, knowledge, education, mental ability. But chakma is much broader. A craftsman possesses chakma. A king requires chakma. A judge needs chakma. A parent practices chakma. It describes skill in living, alignment with reality, the ability to move through God's world in harmony with God's design. And suddenly the symbolism becomes clearer. The tree of life is not merely connected to endless existence. It is connected to life as it was intended to be lived. Life aligned with divine wisdom. Life connected to its source. Life flourishing according to its design. And now the psychological dimension emerges. Because every human being faces the same choice presented in Eden. Not once, daily. Will we define reality for ourselves? Or receive reality as God defines it? Will we trust our own understanding as ultimate, or acknowledge a wisdom greater than ourselves? Those questions sit underneath countless decisions. Relationships, careers, ambitions, values, priorities. Most people imagine the story of Eden ended long ago. But in a sense, it repeats every day. The same temptation, the same tension, the same longing, the same search for life. And Proverbs responds with a startling claim. The pathway back toward life is wisdom, not control, not self-sufficiency, not domination, wisdom. But the pattern does not stop there. The tree of life appears again. Proverbs 11 verse 30. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life. Now the symbol expands even further. First, wisdom is a tree of life. Now righteous living becomes a tree of life. The meaning is growing. The symbol is widening. Its roots are spreading through the biblical imagination. And notice what is happening. The tree of life is no longer a single object. It is becoming a pattern, a reality, a principle. Anything that reconnects human beings to the life of God begins to participate in the symbolism. Then Proverbs does it again. Proverbs 13 verse 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life. This verse feels intensely human, perhaps more human than any verse we have discussed so far, because everyone knows what deferred hope feels like. Waiting, praying, longing, watching years pass, watching doors remain closed, watching promises remain unfulfilled. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. The Hebrew imagery is powerful. not disappointment, sickness, weariness of soul, the exhaustion that comes from carrying longing for too long. And then Solomon says fulfilled desire becomes a tree of life. Once again, the symbol appears, not attached to a physical tree, attached to restoration, fulfillment, healing, life returning where life had been draining away. And suddenly we begin to see a consistent pattern. Every time the tree of life reappears, it appears where life is being restored. Wisdom restoring life, righteousness restoring life, hope fulfilled restoring life. The symbol keeps pointing in the same direction, toward flourishing, toward wholeness, toward communion with the source of life itself. But perhaps the most surprising appearance comes next. Proverbs 15 verse 4. A gentle tongue is a tree of life. At first glance, this seems almost too ordinary. A gentle tongue? Speech? Words? How can that possibly connect to the tree of life? Yet the deeper we think about it, the more profound it becomes. Because words create worlds. Words heal. Words wound. Words encourage. Words destroy. Entire relationships rise or fall because of words. Entire lives can be shaped by words spoken at the right moment, or shattered by words spoken carelessly. And Solomon says, life-giving speech participates in the reality symbolized by the tree of life. The pattern continues, again and again. Life restored, life nurtured, life strengthened, life shared. And now a remarkable realization begins to emerge. The tree of life is no longer merely something humanity lost. It is becoming a glimpse of what humanity was created for, a window into the nature of true life, a recurring signpost pointing toward God's intention for creation. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating, because the biblical authors are not finished expanding the symbol, not even close. The tree of life has moved from Eden into wisdom literature. Soon it will begin appearing in imagery connected to rivers, temples, prophetic restoration, and eventually an entire biblical architecture will emerge. An architecture hidden in plain sight, a pattern stretching from Genesis to Revelation. And once that pattern becomes visible, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. And once that pattern becomes visible, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. Because by the time we reach the final pages of the Bible, the tree of life is no longer standing alone. It is surrounded by symbols we have seen before. A river, a garden, the presence of God. And suddenly the story that began in Genesis starts repeating itself, but in a transformed way. The book of Revelation describes a city. Yet strangely, that city begins to look more and more like a garden. A river flows from the throne of God. Life proceeds outward from the divine presence. And there, standing beside the river, appears the symbol we have been following all along. The tree of life. Not gone, not forgotten, waiting. Revelation does something remarkable. It does not introduce a new symbol to solve the problem of Genesis. It brings back the old one. The symbol from the beginning returns at the end. And that should immediately tell us something important. The Bible is not telling two different stories. It is telling one story, a story of loss, a story of longing, a story of restoration. Now notice what happens when we step back and look at the entire pattern. In Genesis, humanity loses access to the tree of life. In Proverbs, the symbol begins appearing wherever true life is restored. Wisdom becomes a tree of life. Righteousness becomes a tree of life. Healing words become a tree of life. Hope fulfilled becomes a tree of life. The symbol keeps expanding. The meaning keeps growing. The pattern keeps pointing in the same direction, toward restored life, toward restored communion, toward restored relationship. And then Revelation gathers every thread together. The river returns. The tree returns. The presence of God returns. The curse is removed. The separation ends. The exile is over. And this is where the central revelation begins to emerge. What if the tree of life was never primarily about a tree? What if the tree was always pointing beyond itself, toward something deeper, something larger, something the biblical authors were trying to communicate from the very beginning? Because throughout Scripture, life is never, presented as an independent possession. It is always connected to God himself. Life flows from his presence. Life flows from his wisdom. Life flows from relationship with him, which means the tree of life may function as the great symbol of access. Access to the life that comes from God. Access to communion. Access to the reality humanity was created to enjoy. And if that is true, then the story of the tree of life is ultimately not about botany. It is about belonging, not about fruit, but about fellowship, not about a magical object, but about the restoration of a relationship that was broken at the very beginning. And that changes the way we read the entire Bible. And that changes the way we read the entire Bible. Because in the end, the tree of life is not simply a symbol about the past. It is a symbol about the future. And perhaps even more than that. It is a symbol about what human beings have been searching for all along. When most people think about the story of Eden, they focus on what was forbidden. The forbidden fruit, the forbidden choice, the forbidden act. But the Bible seems strangely interested in something else. Not what humanity took, but what humanity lost. Access, communion, life. The kind of life that flows from perfect relationship with the one who created it. And perhaps that is why the tree of life appears at both ends of Scripture, like a doorway, standing at the beginning and the end of the story. In Genesis, the doorway closes. In Revelation, it opens again. The entire biblical narrative unfolds between those two moments. Exile and return. Distance and reunion. Loss and restoration. And suddenly the Bible feels less like a collection of disconnected books and more like a single journey. A journey back toward life. Back toward wholeness. Back toward the presence of God. Perhaps that is the real meaning of the tree of life. Not merely immortality. Not merely endless existence. But life as it was always meant to be. Life connected to its source. Life without separation. Life without fear. Life without the shadow of death. A garden. A river. A tree. And beneath all of them, one quiet promise. That what was lost at the beginning of the story will not remain lost forever.